The courtroom was filled with the usual sounds of people shuffling papers, lawyers whispering to their clients, and the heavy thud of footsteps echoing on the polished wooden floor. It was just another ordinary day, or at least it seemed that way to everyone sitting inside. The judge had not yet entered, but the room already carried the weight of seriousness. Courtrooms often have this feeling like every breath is heavy. Every word is important, and even silence seems louder than usual. People were waiting patiently, some nervously, for their cases to be heard. On one side sat the lawyers in their formal suits, flipping through files and rehearsing their arguments in their heads. On the other side were family members and defendants, some worried, some hopeful, but all focused on what was about to happen. The air was thick with tension and expectation, the kind of tension you could almost touch in the middle of this atmosphere. A young black teenager quietly walked into the room. At first, nobody paid much attention. She looked far too young to be involved in any serious legal matter. Some people assumed she was there to support a family member, while others thought she might have wandered in by mistake. She carried herself calmly, her eyes scanning the room with focus and intelligence. But her youthful face made her stand out instantly as she took her seat. A few heads turned. Whispers began to float through the courtroom, subtle but noticeable. A man sitting near the back leaned toward the person next to him and murmured, "What's a kid doing here?" Another person frowned, confused by her presence. She didn't look nervous, scared, or lost. She looked confident, almost like she belonged there more than anyone else. That alone was enough to spark curiosity. The teenager sat silently, her posture straight, her hands resting on her lap. She didn't fidget or show signs of discomfort. It was as if she had been in courtrooms many times before, even though her young age suggested otherwise. Her calmness was unusual for someone her age in such a serious place. Most teenagers would have been intimidated by the heavy wooden benches, the large books stacked on lawyers' tables, and the sharp glares of seasoned attorneys, but not her. She looked around with sharp eyes, studying every detail, as though the courtroom was not intimidating at all, but rather familiar. The courtroom itself carried an intimidating aura. The high ceilings made voices echo, and the large flag behind the judge's bench reminded everyone that justice here was serious business. Dark wooden furniture, leather-bound law books, and the seal of the court gave the space an old, commanding presence. Too many, the room was overwhelming, but the teenager didn't seem affected. If anything, she looked curious, like she was observing every detail with purpose. Finally, the heavy door at the side opened, and the judge entered. As tradition demanded, everyone in the courtroom stood up. The teenager rose as well, blending in with the crowd, though a few eyes still lingered on her, puzzled by her presence. When everyone sat down, the judge adjusted his robe and glasses before looking around the room with his usual air of superiority. He prided himself on noticing everything and everyone. And it didn't take him long to notice the teenager sitting among adults in the serious environment of his courtroom. His eyes narrowed slightly as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. A childlike face in a place reserved for experienced adults. It almost seemed like a mistake. The judge tilted his head, clearly annoyed, though he didn't speak just yet. Instead, he shuffled some papers in front of him, pretending not to be bothered, though in truth, his curiosity had already been triggered. The rest of the courtroom seemed to sense his mood. Lawyers straightened their ties. Clients sat up straighter, and the air grew even heavier. It was as though everyone was waiting for something to happen, though they couldn't guess what. The teenager, however, remained calm, unaffected by the shifting energy in the room. She opened a small notebook she carried with her, quietly jotting something down, as if preparing for something only she knew about. This simple action caught the attention of more people around her. Teenagers might usually doodle or look distracted, but she wrote carefully, with focus. She flipped through a few pages that were already filled with neat notes, surprising anyone who managed to glance at them. People who noticed began to whisper again, their curiosity deepening. "Why is she writing notes?" one man asked, softly. Another shrugged. "Maybe she's a witness. Or maybe she's just here to watch." But in truth, nobody really knew. And the more they watched her, the more mysterious she seemed. The atmosphere of the courtroom was no longer just heavy with tension, it had become charged with curiosity. The teenager's presence had changed the mood of the entire room without her even speaking a word. Some people were annoyed, others intrigued, but no one could deny that she stood out in a place where everyone was supposed to blend into the serious system of justice. What no one realized, not even the arrogant judge, was that her presence there was far more important than anyone could have guessed. To them, she was just a teenager. To her, this courtroom was about to become the stage where she revealed her true identity and shocked them all. The judge finally settled into his seat, his robe flowing as he leaned back in his chair with authority. He tapped his pen against the desk in a slow, deliberate rhythm, the kind of gesture meant to remind everyone who was in charge. His eyes scanned the courtroom with the same superiority he carried every day. But this time, his gaze stopped almost immediately on the teenager. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to outright irritation. In his mind, a courtroom was no place for children. To him, this was a sacred space reserved for professionals, adults, and those who truly understood the weight of justice. So, when his eyes landed on the young girl sitting calmly in the gallery, he felt insulted as though the very seriousness of his court was being mocked. He straightened in his chair, cleared his throat loudly, and raised an eyebrow in her direction. Well, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "What do we have here? Did someone's daughter wander in by mistake?" Laughter rippled through the room. Some of the lawyers chuckled softly, while a few spectators tried to hide their smiles. The judge smirked, satisfied with his joke. He loved moments like this, where he could put someone in their place and remind everyone of his power. The teenager, however, didn't flinch. She sat still, her face calm, her eyes fixed on the judge. Her silence only seemed to irritate him more. He expected embarrassment, maybe even tears. Instead, he got quiet strength, and that unnerved him. "Tell me, young lady," the judge continued mockingly, leaning forward, "are you here to play lawyer today? Or perhaps you got lost on your way to school?" Again, the courtroom filled. With scattered laughter, the judge enjoyed every second of it. He thought he was teaching a lesson that this was no place for someone so young. To him, the mere presence of a teenager in his courtroom was laughable. He believed he was protecting the dignity of the court, but in reality, his arrogance was on full display for everyone to see. The girl slowly looked down at her notebook, flipped a page, and continued writing, the sound of her pen scratching against the paper was the only response she gave. No words, no anger, just quiet composure. This small act made the judge frown. He wasn't used to people ignoring him. "Excuse me," he said sharply, his tone rising. "Am I boring you?" "I do." "You not realize where you are? This isn't a classroom, young lady. This is a court of law. People's lives are decided here." Every eye in the room turned toward her now. Some were waiting for her to finally break under the pressure. Others began to feel a sense of discomfort, sensing that the judge's words were going too far. But the teenager remained unmoved. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She didn't even look intimidated. She simply kept her poise, and that silent strength was beginning to unsettle more than just the judge. The judge scoffed loudly and shook his head, as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He looked around at the audience, trying to pull them back into his arrogance. "This," he said, with exaggerated emphasis, pointing in her direction, "is exactly what's wrong with today's generation. No respect for authority. No understanding of boundaries. Imagine thinking you can just stroll into a courtroom as if it's some kind of after-school activity." His words carried a sting, and though some in the courtroom chuckled politely, many others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They weren't sure if his harsh tone was truly necessary. But the judge thrived on this kind of attention. He loved making examples out of people, and in his mind, this young girl was the perfect target. What he didn't know was that the more he mocked her, the more he set the stage for his own downfall. His arrogance blinded him to the truth that sat right before his eyes. This was not just a teenager. She wasn't lost, and she certainly wasn't there to play games. She was there with a purpose far greater than he could imagine. Still, the judge wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair with a smug grin. "Tell you what," he said sarcastically. "Why don't you sit quietly and take notes like you're in class? Maybe you'll learn something useful today. Who knows? Maybe one day you'll actually get to be a lawyer if you manage to grow up first." This time, the laughter was thinner, weaker. The crowd sensed something the judge didn't. The teenager's calm eyes and steady posture suggested that she wasn't the least bit humiliated. If anything, she seemed to be waiting for the right moment to reveal why she was there. The silence that followed was heavy. The judge thought he had won, that he had silenced her into submission. But in reality, he had only revealed his own arrogance and prejudice. The teenager's dignity, her calmness under fire, is already starting to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of those watching. Soon, those seeds would grow into shock, disbelief, and finally, respect. But for now, the arrogant judge sat in his chair, convinced he had taught her a lesson. Little did he know, the real lesson was about to come from her hand. It would be one he would never forget. The laughter in the courtroom slowly faded, leaving behind an uneasy silence. The judge leaned back with a smirk on his face, certain he had humiliated the teenager into quiet submission. But what he didn't realize was that the girl's silence was not weakness, was strength. She sat perfectly still, her posture tall and confident, as though she carried an invisible shield around her. Her notebook lay open on her lap, pages already filled with neat, careful handwriting. She picked up her pen again, the metallic click echoing faintly in the hushed room, and continued to write as though nothing had happened. The sound of her pen scratching paper seemed louder than the judge's mocking words just moments earlier. Her calmness was strange to witness. Most people, especially someone so young, would have looked down, fidgeted nervously, or maybe even burst into tears under such ridicule. But this teenager didn't waver. Her face was composed, her breathing steady, her focus unbroken. To those watching closely, it was almost unsettling. One lawyer sitting a few benches away squinted, watching her carefully. He noticed the way her eyes moved quickly across the room, not in fear, but in quiet observation. She wasn't ignoring the judge, she was studying him, just like she was studying everyone else. Every sarcastic remark, every laugh from the audience, every sigh from the clerk seat was as though she was collecting information, piece by piece. In her mind, the judge, however, mistook her composure for defiance. He hated being ignored, and her refusal to break under his mockery pricked his pride like a thorn. He tapped his gavel once, sharply, making the whole room jump. "Did you hear me, young lady?" T demanded, his voice loud and commanding. The girl finally lifted her head. Slowly, deliberately, she looked straight at the judge. Her eyes were steady, unflinching, and strangely calm for someone so young. There was no fear in them, only quiet determination. For the first time that day, the judge faltered. He wasn't sure why, but the way she looked at him made him feel unsettled. It was not the look of a child being scolded. It was the look of someone who knew something he didn't. She didn't speak. Not yet. She simply nodded politely, then returned her gaze to her notebook, flipping to a fresh page. Her pen began to glide once again, faster this time, as if the judge's outburst had only given her more material to write down. The courtroom grew quieter. The earlier laughter had faded completely, replaced by curiosity. People leaned slightly forward, whispering less and watching more. It was clear that this teenager wasn't ordinary. Something about her calmness didn't fit the image of a lost child or a curious bystander. She carried herself with the composure of someone who had been here before. Someone who understood the gravity of the courtroom far better than the judge assumed. A bailiff, standing near the back, glanced at her repeatedly. He had worked in this courtroom for years and had seen dozens of nervous witnesses and frightened defendants. But he had never seen a teenager sit so calmly under pressure, especially after being mocked in front of everyone. It was as if she had built a wall around herself that no insult could break. The judge tried to move on, calling the next case, but even as lawyers stood to argue, his eyes kept darting back toward her. Something about her silence gnawed at him. She hadn't reacted the way he wanted. She hadn't cowered, hadn't pleaded, hadn't even raised her voice. And that composure made him feel strangely powerless. Meanwhile, the teenager kept writing. Every now and then, she would pause, glance up briefly, and then return to her notes. The more she wrote, the more people around her grew curious. Some leaned ever so slightly to see what was on the page, but they couldn't make out the neat lines of text. All they could see was that she wasn't scribbling idly, she was taking serious notes. The kind of notes only someone with deep understanding would make. Minutes passed like this, but the calmness of the teenager seemed to stretch time itself. People began to notice her more than the actual proceedings. It was strange. An entire courtroom, full of experienced lawyers and an authoritative judge, was now unconsciously revolving around the presence of one silent girl. Her calmness was more powerful than any outburst could have been. It made people wonder, who was she? Why was she here? And why did she seem so unaffected by the judge's attempts to belittle her? For the teenager, every second was deliberate. Her silence wasn't accidental. She knew that words spoken too soon could be wasted, and she wasn't about to waste hers. She was waiting for the right moment, the perfect moment, to reveal who she truly was. Until then, she let the judge mock, let the whispers float, let the courtroom doubt. She knew the truth, and that truth gave her a calmness no one could shake. Even the judge, with all his arrogance, felt a twinge of unease he couldn't explain. It was as if the teenager's silence was louder than his gavel. He didn't know it yet, but the calmness that irritated him now would soon become the very thing that turned his courtroom upside down. Asterisk. The courtroom ticked forward with its usual rhythm, lawyers presenting motions, witnesses being called, and the clerk reading names off the docket. But beneath the surface of ordinary procedure, there was an invisible tension growing. It wasn't because of the cases being heard. It was because of the teenager sitting quietly, writing notes as though she had all the time in the world. The judge tried to push her from his mind, focusing on the files before him, but he couldn't. His pride wouldn't allow it. The girl's calmness still burned in the back of his thoughts. Who was she? Why wasn't she rattled? Why did she continue to behave as though she had some secret no one else knew? The judge convinced himself she was just stubborn, a child trying to act strong. But deep down, a part of him was unsettled. Finally, after several cases had been called, a clerk stood and announced the next matter on the docket. The name echoed through the courtroom, and to everyone's surprise, the teenager quietly closed her notebook and stood up. A ripple of shock ran through the room. Every head turned. Whispers filled the air like a gust of wind. She's involved in the case? Someone murmured. Impossible. She's just a kid. Another voice hissed. Wait, is she a witness? Someone else whispered. But the teenager didn't rush. She didn't stumble. She walked forward with measured steps, each one confident, echoing softly across the wooden floor. She carried no fear, no hesitation. The way she approached the front of the courtroom was not the walk of a nervous child, it was the stride of someone who belonged there. The judge's smirk returned, but weaker this time. He leaned back in his chair, watching her with an expression that mixed irritation and curiosity. "And what exactly do you think you're doing?" asked, his tone laced with condescension. "The witness stand is over there, young lady." But the teenager didn't move toward the witness stand. Instead, she walked to the attorney's table. Gasps filled the courtroom. She placed her notebook neatly on the table, pulled out a stack of organized files from her bag, and set them down with precision. The room froze. For a moment, it was as if time itself had stopped. The girl adjusted her papers, then turned to face the judge with calm, unwavering eyes. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear, steady, and commanding. "Your Honor," she said, "I am counsel for the defense in this matter." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Silence swallowed the air. Every person present stared in disbelief. Even the lawyers who had been smirking earlier were now wide-eyed, their jaws slightly open. The judge blinked rapidly, as though he hadn't heard correctly. He leaned forward, his arrogance faltering. "I beg your pardon," she repeated without hesitation, her tone even firmer this time. "I am the defense attorney in this case." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. "She's an attorney. That's impossible. How old is she?" People leaned toward each other, whispering frantically, trying to make sense of what they had just heard. The teenager calmly reached into her bag once more and handed a document to the bailiff, who walked it up to the judge. "Ah!" The judge snatched it, his eyes scanning the page quickly. His face tightened as he realized it was official. Her bar admission. Her credentials were real. She wasn't a child pretending. She wasn't playing dress-up. She was exactly what she claimed to be, a licensed attorney. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. For once, his voice betrayed him, a hint of disbelief slipping through. This can't be right. You're far too young." The girl met his gaze steadily, not a flicker of doubt in her expression. "Age," she replied softly but firmly, "does not measure ability." The audience fell completely silent. The weight of her words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the gavel itself. In that moment, the atmosphere of the courtroom flipped entirely. Just minutes ago, the judge had ridiculed her, reducing her to the punchline of a cruel joke. But now, faced with the undeniable truth, he had been stripped of his superiority. The same teenager he mocked was standing before him as his equal, no, more than his equal. She had passed the same exams, met the same standards, and earned the same right to stand in that courtroom as any other lawyer. The judge swallowed hard, his pride stinging like a fresh wound. He glanced around the room, realizing how many eyes were on him, waiting to see what he would do. His earlier arrogance now threatened to boomerang back on him, exposing him as a man who judged without thinking. The girl, meanwhile, showed no signs of gloating. She wasn't there to humiliate him in return. Her calmness, her quiet confidence, spoke louder than any insult ever could. She opened her file, flipped to the first page, and said, "Shall we proceed, Your Honor?" Those 4 words sealed the moment. The balance of power in the room had shifted forever. What began as a day where a teenager was mocked had transformed into something unforgettable. Everyone in the courtroom, lawyers, clerks, spectators, even the bailiff, realized they were Witnessing history, a twist no one could have imagined. The young black teenager the judge had ridiculed was, in fact, a genius attorney in disguise. And from this moment forward, the case, the courtroom, and the judge himself would never be the same. The judge sat frozen, his eyes locked on the teenager standing at the attorney's table. For a long moment, he said nothing. His hands gripped the edge of his bench as though he needed something to hold on to. His earlier smirk was gone, erased completely, leaving behind a face that looked strangely uncertain. The mighty judge, who, only minutes ago, had mocked her openly, now found himself speechless. The courtroom was silent, so quiet that even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed loud. Everyone's eyes darted between the teenager and the judge, waiting to see how he would react. The man who had ridiculed her so confidently now looked like he had been struck by a blow he never saw coming. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. This is highly irregular, he stammered, his voice lacking the firmness it carried earlier. He straightened in his chair, forcing himself to appear in control, but his hands betrayed him. He shuffled the papers before him more than necessary, his fingers tapping nervously against the desk. The girl stood calmly, her hands folded neatly over her file. She didn't move, didn't frown, didn't smirk. She didn't need to. Her very presence was enough to remind the judge of his mistake. The silence between them was louder than any argument. The judge finally found his voice again, though it trembled at the edges. You're telling me that you're counsel for the defense? Yes, Your Honor, the teenager replied, her tone steady, almost gentle. That is correct. The way she spoke was striking. Her voice carried no arrogance, no anger, no need to return the insult he had thrown at her earlier. It was simply calm, respectful, and firm. That composure unnerved the judge even more. He expected her to be flustered, to try desperately to prove herself. But she did none of that. She acted as though she had nothing to prove. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, the crowd buzzing with disbelief. She's really an attorney. But how? Is that even possible? Every whisper made the judge's face burn hotter. He was the one in power, yet right now, it felt like all the attention and authority belonged to her. He slammed his gavel once, more forcefully than necessary. Order in the court. He barked, his voice louder than before, but it carried a hint of desperation. He wasn't silencing the room. He was trying to silence his own humiliation, but the courtroom didn't return to normal. Even when the murmur stopped, the atmosphere had shifted. The judge was no longer the unquestioned figure of authority. Instead, every eye lingered on the teenager, waiting to see what she would do next. The judge's thoughts raced. How could this be possible? She's just a child. She looks barely old enough to drive, let alone practice law. He flipped through the document again, hoping to find a mistake, something to invalidate her claim. But there it was, stamped and sealed. Proof that she had passed the bar. Proof that she had earned her place. His arrogance, the armor he wore every day, was cracking. He could feel it. He had built his reputation on control, on mocking those he saw as beneath him, on asserting dominance. But now, in front of an entire courtroom, his pride had been challenged in the most unexpected way. The girl, however, showed no interest in his struggle. She opened her file, flipped to her notes, and began preparing to present her case as though everything was perfectly ordinary. Her calmness was a mirror, reflecting back his own insecurity. And that was what shook him the most. He tried to reassert himself. Well, he said, his voice louder than necessary. Credentials or not, this is highly unusual. You must understand how this looks. A teenager standing here, claiming to be an attorney, not claiming your honor. She interrupted politely, her voice even. "I am an attorney." The interruption was subtle, but it pierced him deeply. It wasn't rude, it wasn't loud, but it was firm, undeniable. The judge's mouth snapped shut. For once in his career, he was at a loss for words. Around the room, people exchanged glances. Some smiled faintly, impressed by her courage. Others sat in awe, unable to believe what they were witnessing. The one smug judge, who had ridiculed a young black teenager without hesitation, was now being humbled in the most public way possible. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He tried to focus on the case to regain some semblance of control. But his mind wouldn't let go of the fact that the person he had mocked was now standing before him as his equal. No, not just his equal, his superior in composure, confidence, and dignity. Every time he looked at her, he saw not a child, but a mirror reflecting his arrogance. And that reflection made him feel small. For the rest of the courtroom, however, the moment was transformative. They weren't watching a judge anymore. They were watching a man exposed. And they weren't watching a teenager. They were watching a genius in disguise. Someone who had walked into a room full of doubt and turned it into a stage for her brilliance. The shock on the judge's face was more than just surprise. It was the beginning of a realization he could not escape. He had underestimated her, and in doing so, it revealed more about his own flaws than about hers. And as the trial prepared to move forward, one truth became clear to everyone in the room. The story was no longer about the case itself. It was about the young attorney who had turned the courtroom upside down, and the arrogant judge who was learning, piece by painful piece, that appearances can be the greatest deception of all. The shuffle of papers echoed faintly as the teenager placed her file on the attorney's table. Her movements were precise, deliberate. Every page she turned seemed to carry weight, as if she had already mapped out every step of what she was about to do. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with disbelief only moments ago, now sat in expectant silence. All eyes were fixed on her. When she finally rose to speak, she didn't rush. She let the silence linger for a moment longer, a silence so deep that even the ticking of the courtroom clock seemed loud. Then, with a calm but steady voice, she began. "Your Honor, members of the court," she said, her tone measured and clear, "the defense is ready to proceed." The words were simple, but the way she said them carried a quiet authority. It wasn't the shaky voice of a young girl pretending to be confident. It was the firm, collected voice of someone who had spent countless hours studying, preparing, and mastering her craft. The prosecutor smirked, clearly still underestimating her. He rose quickly, towering over her with an air of superiority. "Your Honor," he said, "while it's unusual to see such a young defense attorney, the facts of this case are straightforward. The defendant is guilty. The evidence is overwhelming. I don't see how the defense intends to argue otherwise." The judge leaned forward, trying to hide his unease behind a mask of authority. "Proceed," he said stiffly, gesturing toward the girl. His voice was firm, but inside he was rattled. He wanted to see her fail. He needed her to fail. Only then could he reclaim the dignity she had quietly stolen from him. The teenager calmly opened her file and lifted her eyes toward the court. "With respect, Your Honor," she said, "the prosecution's statement is misleading. The evidence is not overwhelming. In fact, when examined closely, the evidence does not support guilt at all." Her words sliced through the courtroom like a blade. Murmurs rose again, but she pressed on, unshaken. She began to dissect the case, piece by piece. Every fact the prosecution had leaned on, she challenged with logic and clarity. She pointed to inconsistencies in witness testimonies, highlighted errors in the timeline of events, and questioned the reliability of the evidence presented. What stunned the courtroom was not just her knowledge, but her delivery. She spoke with a rhythm that pulled everyone in, her arguments flowing smoothly from one point to the next. She wasn't reading nervously from her notes. She was speaking as if the entire case lived inside her mind, as if she had absorbed every detail until it became second nature. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, his earlier smirk fading. Each time he tried to interject, she anticipated his counterargument and addressed it before he could speak. It was as if she was playing a game of chess, and she had already mapped out every move he would make. The judge, who had once mocked her openly, now sat in stunned silence. He tried to maintain his stern expression, but his eyes betrayed him. He was watching brilliance unfold before him. Brilliance he had dismissed as impossible only minutes ago at one point. The girl lifted a piece of evidence the prosecution had presented earlier. She held it up for the court to see. "This document," she said firmly, "was submitted as proof. But if we examine it closely, we find discrepancies, dates that do not align, signatures that do not match. This is not proof of guilt. This is proof of sloppy work." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor's face flushed red. He snatched the document back, flipping through it quickly, his confidence unraveling in front of everyone. The judge shifted again, his pride burning. The very same teenager he had ridiculed was now tearing apart the prosecution's case with precision and grace. The more she spoke, the more the courtroom leaned toward her. Even those who had doubted her at the start now sat with wide eyes, hanging on her every word. Her voice was steady but passionate, her logic sharp but compassionate. She wasn't just defending her clients, she was showing the court that truth mattered more than appearances. That justice was blind to age, race, or status. She concluded with a line that seemed to echo against the wooden walls long after she spoke it. Justice is not about how someone looks, how old they are, or what others assume of them. Justice is about truth. And the truth here is clear. The defendant is innocent. The silence that followed was unlike any silence before. It wasn't awkward or mocking, it was respect. The courtroom that had once laughed at her now sat in awe. Even the prosecutor, flustered and defeated, struggled to find words. The judge's gavel remained untouched. For once, he didn't interrupt. He didn't mock. He didn't belittle. He simply sat there, stunned, as the teenager returned to her seat with quiet dignity. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate, didn't gloat. She just calmly closed her file as if this was exactly what she expected to happen. And maybe it was. For the courtroom, the shift was undeniable. The powerful judge who had once ridiculed her now seemed small, while the young attorney who had walked in as a teenager had revealed herself as a force of intellect and truth. Her argument had not only defended her client, it had shattered every stereotype that had tried to box her in. And though the trial was not yet over, everyone in the room already knew the arrogant judge would never forget the day he mocked a teenager, only to watch her rise higher than he ever imagined. The air inside the courtroom felt different now. What had started as a day filled with laughter at a judge's cruel joke had transformed into something much greater. The same people who had chuckled when the teenager was mocked now sat motionless, their eyes fixed on her with a new kind of attention. It wasn't amusement anymore, it was admiration. The shift had been gradual, almost invisible at first. It began with her voice, steady and unshaken. Then came her arguments, sharp and logical, slicing through the prosecutor's case like a blade through paper. With every point she made, the laughter of the past hour seemed smaller, weaker, and more shameful. By now, nobody was laughing. The prosecutor, once so confident, shuffled in frustration at his table. His shoulders slumped, his face grew red, and his hands shook slightly as he flipped through his files. Every time he tried to regain control, the teenager was already a step ahead. She countered his points before he could finish them, her tone, calm but firm, leaving him exposed and unprepared. Spectators leaned forward on their benches, eyes wide, lips slightly parted. The young girl had captivated them, and they didn't even realize when they had stopped doubting her. Some of them even felt guilty for laughing earlier. They had been quick to judge her by her age and her appearance, just as the arrogant judge had done, but now, faced with the brilliance of her mind, they couldn't deny the truth. They had been wrong. Even the court clerks, usually hidden in the background, glanced at her with awe. One of them, a middle-aged woman who had worked in the courthouse for years, found herself smiling faintly. She had seen countless lawyers pass through the courtroom, but never had she seen someone so young command such respect with nothing more than intelligence and composure. The bailiff, a stern man known for showing no emotion, shifted uncomfortably. At first, but as he watched the teenager dismantle arguments with ease, he too began to soften. His usual stone-like face cracked into the smallest of approving nods, and then there was the judge, the man who had ridiculed her in front of everyone. Now sat quietly, his earlier arrogance crumbling piece by piece. His lips pressed tightly together, his jaw tense, his fingers drumming nervously on the bench. He looked less like a figure of authority and more like a man who had been exposed. Every time the girl spoke, his pride took another hit. He had tried to paint her as a child out of place, but her brilliance painted him instead a man blinded by arrogance. A judge who had underestimated someone simply because she didn't fit his idea of power. The courtroom could sense it. For the first time in years, people weren't looking to the judge as the center of authority. They were looking to her. The turning point came when she presented her final piece of evidence. With quiet confidence, she walked to the center of the courtroom, holding a file that the prosecution had ignored. Her voice was calm, but her words carried a weight that filled the room. She pointed out contradictions so clear, so undeniable, that even the judge himself couldn't pretend not to notice. This evidence, she said firmly, proves not guilt, but innocence. And it proves, Your Honor, that truth cannot be dismissed, simply because the messenger is unexpected. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the sound of papers rustling broke it. The words hung in the air like a challenge, not only to the prosecution, but to the judge himself. Slowly, the spectators began to nod. One man whispered, "She's right." Another murmured, "Brilliant." The courtroom, once filled with doubt, was now filled with belief. Belief in her. Belief in the truth she had laid bare. The prosecutor sat down heavily, defeated. He had no more arguments, no more tricks. The girl had taken everything he had and turned it against him. The judge shifted in his chair, his pride wounded. For years, he had been the most powerful voice in the room. But now, his voice was silent, and hers carried the room instead. He felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, waiting for his response. And for the first time in his career, he realized. They weren't expecting him to lead, they were expecting him to follow. The balance of the courtroom had shifted completely. The teenager, once ridiculed, was now the center of respect. The authority once claimed by the judge was gone, replaced by admiration for the young attorney who had proven everyone wrong. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about courage. It was about breaking stereotypes. It was about the strength of intelligence over arrogance. And as she returned to her seat, calmly closing her file as though nothing extraordinary had happened, the people in that courtroom knew they had witnessed something they would never forget. The judge had mocked her. The court had doubted her. But the turning point had come in. She had turned it in her favor. The courtroom was no longer the same place it had been that morning. The energy had shifted completely. What began with mocking laughter and cruel arrogance had ended in silence, respect, and awe. The young black teenager who everyone had doubted sat quietly at her table, her hands resting calmly on her file. She didn't smile in triumph, nor did she seek praise. She simply looked forward, her eyes steady, as though she had expected this outcome all along. The prosecutor sat slumped in his chair, defeated, his notes scattered uselessly in front of him. He knew he had been outmatched not by another seasoned attorney, but by a girl half his age who carried more courage and intelligence than he had ever faced in a courtroom. He avoided her gaze, ashamed not just of his loss, but of the way he had doubted her from the start. And then there was the judge, the man who had ridiculed her. Earlier now looked small behind his bench. His arrogance had vanished, replaced by something he was not used to feeling: humility. He had laughed at her, mocked her, and treated her like she was beneath the law. But now he had no choice but to acknowledge what everyone else had already seen. She was not just worthy of respect, she commanded it. For a long moment, he said nothing. His gavel sat untouched beside him, his pride heavy on his shoulders. The silence stretched on, and in that silence, the courtroom seemed to be waiting not for him to speak, but for him to admit the truth. Finally, with a stiff throat, the judge leaned forward. His voice was softer now, stripped of its earlier cruelty. "This court has witnessed a remarkable display of skill today," he said, his words slow and measured. "The defense has presented arguments with clarity, precision, and undeniable brilliance. The evidence is clear. The case against the defendant is dismissed." Gasps filled the room. But the loudest sound wasn't the dismissal, it was the unspoken realization that the arrogant judge had been forced to admit his mistake. His words, though formal, carried more than just the outcome of a case. They carried an apology that his pride would not allow him to speak directly. The teenager bowed her head respectfully, not to celebrate victory, but to honor the justice she had fought for. She didn't gloat, didn't rub her success in the judge's face. Her quiet dignity spoke louder than any celebration ever could. Around the courtroom, spectators whispered among themselves. Some had tears in their eyes, touched by what they had witnessed. They knew they had seen more than just a trial. They had seen a lesson written in real time. A lesson about humility, about prejudice, and about never underestimating someone based on their age, race, or appearance. The bailiff, usually unshaken, stepped forward to escort the defendant out. But before leaving, he glanced at the teenager and gave her a small nod of respect. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. She had won more than a case, she had won hearts. The court clerks exchanged glances, some smiling quietly, knowing they would talk about this day for years to come. They had seen countless trials, countless lawyers, and countless judges. But none of them had ever seen a moment like this. The judge cleared his throat again, trying to regain his authority, but it was too late. Authority no longer rested solely with him. It had shifted permanently in the eyes of everyone who had been there. His mocking words would be remembered, yes, but not as a symbol of power. They would be remembered as the starting point of a story in which arrogance was shattered by intelligence. As the teenager gathered her papers and prepared to leave, the room seemed to part for her. Spectators stepped aside, giving her space, as though she was something more than just an attorney. She was a symbol now, symbol of possibility, of resilience, of the truth that brilliance can come from anywhere. And though she never once sought recognition, she had earned something far greater than applause. She had earned respect. The lesson of that day was clear. Never judge someone by how they look. Never assume weakness in youth, or ignorance in silence, or failure in indifference. Because sometimes the person you laugh at, the person you underestimate, the person you dismiss might just be the one to outshine everyone else. The arrogant judge would remember that day for the rest of his career. Every time he saw a young face in his courtroom, every time he was tempted to mock or belittle, he would remember the teenager who stood tall against his arrogance and proved him wrong. And for those who had been there, the memory would remain, forever etched in their minds. The day a young black teenager walked into a courtroom, ridiculed and doubted, and walked out as a genius attorney who had changed everything. Because true power doesn't come from mocking others. True power comes from knowledge, courage, and the ability to stand tall in the face of doubt. That was the lesson the judge learned. That was the lesson the courtroom learned. And that was the lesson the world would never forget.